Genesis down the road. But here in chapter 24, Abraham is nearing the end of his life. The final act for him is to make preparations for a bride for his son Isaac. And as we've already studied, there is a commissioning that has taken place where his faithful servant, likely Eleazar, even though he is not named, has agreed to go back to Abraham's homeland for the purpose of finding a woman who will be Isaac's bride. This woman cannot be a Canaanite. The blood of the son of the covenant cannot have his blood mixed with the wicked, sinful Canaanite individuals. And so the servant has been commissioned to go back to Abram's homeland to find a wife from Abram's family who is not of a Canaanite origin, and that God would lead and orchestrate the circumstances by which the servant would be able to find the woman that God had chosen for him. What we talked about in our first exploration in chapter 24 is that under no circumstance is Isaac to go to Abraham's homeland and to find a wife for himself. There is not to be a turning back from the land of promise to the land of old, and I believe that that is indicative of the fact that to leave the land of promise is to risk walking away from the promise that God has made. If Isaac were to go back and enjoy his new family and to stay there and find a life for himself, perhaps he would never go back to the promised land. And as a footnote to that idea, never in all of Isaac's life did he ever leave the perimeter of the land of promise. He never did go back and never did risk losing what was promised to Abram and his descendants in the land of promise that we have been looking at for all of this time. So we've seen the servant's faith in making this oath and taking this months-long journey to the homeland to find the woman that God had ordained to be the bride of Abraham's son, Isaac. So the servant prays that when he gets there, that he arrives at the watering hole and that he asks a woman to water for a drink of water. She offers to water the camels. And as we know, this is exactly what has happened. It is God's providential provision to supply to the servant the exact woman that God had chosen to be the wife of Abraham's son, Isaac. And so this takes place. Rebekah is the first woman that the servant encounters. It doesn't take days or weeks or even months. The very first person who comes that he asks for a drink of water is in fact the very one that God had ordained to be the wife of Isaac. What I didn't bring out last week that I do want to mention here is that when the servant prayed out loud, "Blessed be the God of my master Abraham," Rebekah hears who it is this servant has come to her city on behalf of. So it's probable that she knows something about an individual named Abraham. There's not a lot of detail woven into this narrative for us to connect those dots together, but Rebekah knows that Abraham is behind this providential meeting, and this most likely excites her, having heard or known something about this Abraham who left this land so many years ago, approximately 70 or 75 years earlier. So the servant will now have the opportunity to meet Rebekah's family and request that she would accompany him back to Isaac in the land of promise in order for her to become his wife. So as we continue in the ongoing outline here, we come to letter C, and this is God's faithfulness. This is the longest section within this chapter longest section within this chapter. It begins in verse 28, goes all the way through the end of 59. This 24th chapter is the longest in the section up to this point. I think it's actually the longest in all of the book of Genesis. And so we're going to look at this in very small pieces so we can remember what it is we are talking about. So number one, we see the report here. Verse 28, then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. She tells her household about this meeting with this individual, the request for a drink of water, the watering of the camel, the giving of the gifts. And so she's run back and told her family about this. It's interesting that it's reported that she goes to the mother, not to the father's household, and many conclude that this is because this part of the narrative is about the mother who is going to be giving birth to the descendants, where the father through Abraham and Isaac is already established. It is the mother's household, Rebekah's mother, who is now brought in to this narrative. Rachel undoubtedly is intrigued by what she has seen and heard, the gifts that were given to her, the prayer that she has heard the servant pray, and so she runs back to her family to tell them all that had happened. So this serves as a transition to what has already happened in chapter 24 and what is about to happen as she now goes back to report this to her family. So we see the greeting here, number 2. And these verses were introduced to Rebekah's brother, Laban. And if you've read or studied much about the book of Genesis, the name of Laban ought to stand out. Rebekah's father, Bethuel, is almost an afterthought in this episode, but Laban, who is Rebekah's brother, is front and center. This is the same Laban who will later mistreat Jacob, who is the son of Isaac and Rebekah, and he will mistreat Jacob by tricking him into marrying his daughter Leah instead of his other daughter Rachel, whom Isaac preferred. You remember that story that goes through there? So Laban will become a nemesis to Jacob all throughout Jacob's life, and when we get to the upcoming chapters of Genesis, we will see some of this, but here Moses is introducing us to Laban's character, which will soon be exposed in this narrative, and which will later be front and center as Laban deals with Jacob, again, the son to Isaac and Rachel. Reading together verses 29 all the way through 32, here's what our narrative tells us. Now Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran outside to the man at the spring. When he saw the ring and the bracelets of his sister's wrists, when he heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, saying, "This is what the man said to me," he went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. And he said, "Come in, blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside, since I have prepared the house and a place for the camels?" So the man entered the house. Then Laban unloaded the camels and he gave them straw and feed to the camels and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. So this is important because, again, it is introducing us to Laban, this character that we're going to learn more about here and then later in the book of Genesis. And so after Laban sees the gold, the jewelry, the gifts that were given to his sister, he runs outside to meet the servant, and he greets him while he's still at the well and the camels are still in a kneeling position. We have no idea how far the house is from the spring or the well that the water was drawn from, but the idea here, and it's kind of mixed up in the way we would understand the order, is that Rachel tells the story. Laban sees the gifts of gold that were given to his sister Rebekah, and then he runs out to meet this servant. It's turned around for us in the way the Hebrew is expressed. It's part of the literary style. And so what Laban sees is the gifts of gold jewelry. He hears what Rebekah has told him about the encounter, and he immediately runs to meet the servant before he has even had a chance to follow Rebekah back to the house. So as Rebekah runs to tell her family about this encounter, Laban runs to greet this wealthy gift giver. Moses here exposes the character of Laban. He is greedy and he is materialistically oriented. I wonder how many guests would have come to the house where Laban says, "Okay, we got to get out some stuff for them, and I don't know how long they're going to be here, and this is a big inconvenience to us." But here, it's very, very different because of the story that Laban has heard and the gifts of gold jewelry that Rebekah has brought back to the house with her. So his interest in the visitor is going to be centered around this idea: how is this going to benefit me? Now we'll see this in more accurately in greater detail as we go through this. So Rebekah has received these valuable gifts, and as her brother, there may be gifts for him as well. So Laban's greediness is expressed through his gestures of hospitality, running out to greet the individual. He greets him with this greeting, "Come in, blessed of the Lord." And so it's unlikely that he has ever greeted any other visitors this way. Now, we aren't told anything about the worship practices of Rebekah's family, but Laban uses the covenant name Yahweh in his greeting of the servant. Now, if you remember way back, Abraham's family, when they were in Ur of the Chaldeans, worshiped the moon gods, plural, and it's very likely that this part of Abraham's family is still worshiping those moon gods. We don't have any idea if the worship of the one true God, Yahweh, has made it back to Laban's family. It's a detail that we aren't provided for in the reading of the scripture, but it's very likely that Laban here is simply repeating the name of this God that he heard Rebekah use as a way of garnering some kind of affection or connection to the visitor that is now going to be coming back with him and staying in the home. So this reference here of Laban calling on the name Yahweh should not infer that he and Rebekah's family are worshipers of Yahweh, but he is very simply using this extremely friendly gesture, repeating the name of the God that the servant has used as a way of ingratiating himself with this guest. So he goes out while he's still at the well. He invites him to come back to the house. And as we look at this section of the narrative, it is phrased in such a way that it makes it sound like Laban has brought them back, that he himself has unloaded all the stuff that's on the backs of these 10 camels, that he himself has laid out the straw in the feed and the bedding for the camels. But it's more than likely that he's just giving the orders and taking the credit for it as the son in the household. So again, this is a literary style designed to show how hard Laban is working to curry favor from the servant. So this is the greeting that is given to the servant here on behalf of Abraham, and this brings us now to the mission, the reason why the servant is here. We'll begin this in verse 33. But when food was set before him to eat, he said, "I will not eat until I have told my business." And he, Laban, said, "Speak on." So as a part of the custom of hospitality, as we know, food is given to the visitor, but for the servant, because he is on a mission, the mission of his servant, of his master Abraham, he's not ready to eat. He feels like it's more important for him to conduct the business at hand than it is for him to satisfy his own needs for food and for refreshment. So this is an aspect of ancient culture and custom, business before pleasure. So the servant doesn't want to negate the importance of his master's business by delaying the conducting of this business and in going through this meal. He wants to get right to the heart of the matter, and this finds great favor upon Laban's ear, who says, "Speak on. Let's get to the heart of the matter, because after all, I see you are a very wealthy individual. I see these incredibly expensive gifts you've given to my sister, and I'm wondering if there's something in this conversation for me." So as the mission now gets expressed, we're going to look at this in 3 subsets. The first one in letter A is his master. So the servant is going to tell the family something about his master. It's necessary to provide Rebekah's family with the necessary background information. So he says in verse 34 to verse 36, so he said, "I am Abraham's servant. The Lord Yahweh has greatly blessed my master so that he has become rich. And he has given him flocks and herds and silver and gold and servants and maids and camels and donkeys. Now Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master in her old age, and he has given him all that he has." So the servant establishes the one that he serves. This is Abraham. And again, it's very likely that Rebekah's family knows something about this Abraham, even though he has left some 70 years prior. So Abraham is a part of their native tribe. He is a very wealthy man, and he has given all that he has to this son that was born to his wife Sarah in her old age. So this does a couple of things. One, it opens the door for Rebekah's family to consider the request that is going to come, since Abraham is a part of this family tribe. Secondly, it establishes that Abraham is a very wealthy man, and he has a son, and I would imagine that Laban can fill in the blanks here. He can read between the lines, and he's probably thinking, oh boy, this is going to get good, because this very wealthy man is going to need a wife for this son of his who is going to inherit all that he has. You'll notice that Abraham doesn't talk about this inheritance being divided up amongst a family or a number of sons, but instead this one son who was born to his wife Sarah in her old age. So the servant recounts the miraculous birth of this son, since he was born to Sarah in her old age. That would very easily be understood in a pantheistic people group, that something miraculous has happened that has brought about the birth of this son to this woman in her old age. And that phrase, in her old age, would mean very clearly a birth way beyond what would be considered the normal childbearing years of a woman. So the servant recounts this miraculous birth, and this also heightens the interest in the story and in this mission, because it now has the sense of not only being a mission for a bride, but a divine mission that has some kind of a deity wrapped up within it. So secondly here, letter B, the servant tells about his oath. And this takes us from 37 all the way down to verse 41. So my master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I live, but you shall go to my father's house and to my relatives and take a wife for my son. I said to my master, suppose the woman does not follow me. He said to me, the Lord before whom I have walked will send his angel with you to make your journey successful, and you will take a wife for my son from my relatives and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my relatives, and if they do not give her to you, you will be free from my oath. So again, the servant is simply retelling what has already taken place, that which we have already studied. And so this soon-to-be rich son needs a wife, and the servant has made me swear an oath to help my master find a wife from amongst Abraham's family. And oh, by the way, that's you people. So this is an incredibly important mission. My master's son needs a wife. It has a sense of divine origin wrapped up within it. Abraham is called upon his God to lead me in fulfilling this mission, and my master is confident that his God is going to accomplish this. So it's important to remember that this wife-seeking mission is being led by the Lord, as this will increase the likelihood that Rebekah's family will be receptive to it. So there's several components here. Abraham is from their family. Abraham is incredibly rich. This has a divine mission woven into it. And so Rebekah's family has to be on the edge of their seats, waiting for the shoe to drop to find out exactly what the end of this mission is going to be. So what the servant repeats back to the family that we see in verse 39 is that it allows for the possibility that the woman will refuse the offer of marriage when it comes, but Abraham is convinced that this is not going to take place. Again, hinting of their need to follow through with the divine nature of this mission. And that brings us to the final part of the retelling of this mission, and that's letter C, the encounter. So this takes us from verse 42 all the way down to verse 49. Again, a retelling of the story. So I came today to the spring and said, O Lord Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, if you will now make my journey on which I go successful, behold, I'm standing by the spring, and may it be that the maiden who comes out to draw, and to whom I say, please let me drink a little water from your jar, and she will say to me, you drink, and I will draw water. I will draw for your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. Now, pausing right here, again, retelling the prayer that was prayed so that the servant would know who the woman that God had ordained is. Before I finished speaking, verse 45, in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder and went down to the spring and drew. And I said to her, please let me drink. She quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder and said, drink, and I will water your camels also. So I drank, and she watered the camels also. So there it is, the fulfillment of the prayer that the servant prayed, an indication that God, the author of this divine mission, has led the servant to Rebekah, who has done these things. Verse 47, then I asked her, and she said, then I asked her and said, whose daughter are you? And she said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. And I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her wrist. And I bowed low and worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had guided me in the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. So now, if you are going to deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me, and if not, let me know that I may turn to the right hand or to the left. So what the servant is saying here is that this is a divine mission. This is what my master asked me to do. This is the prayer that I prayed. This is how your Rebekah, your sister, your daughter, has fulfilled that prayer. It's very clear to me that this is the woman that God has ordained for me to take back to my master Abraham so that she can marry Abraham's son Isaac, who is going to be the inheritor of this great wealth. I can see the light. Do you see the light as well? It's a rhetorical question. It's one that doesn't really require an answer. And so the servant has set them up to say, oh, by all means, we can see that God has ordained this. By all means, take this girl back to your master and let her become the wife of his son. So the divine mission has led the servant to Rebekah. She has satisfied all the conditions that the servant established in his prayer. The servant prays, and Yahweh answered his prayer by sending Rebekah to meet him. And so everything has taken place exactly as he had prayed, indicating that the divine mission has been fulfilled. He's conducted his business before his hosts, and verse 49 pushes the hosts to make a decision. As the Lord has dealt kindly with me by answering my prayer and the request of my master, will you also deal kindly with me and grant my request? If not, let me know, and I will make other arrangements. So again, everything's been laid out. There's only one thing that the family can realistically say, and that is yes. This takes us to number 4 in the outline, the decision. Verse 50 down to verse 52. Then Laban and Bethuel replied, the matter comes from the Lord Yahweh, so we cannot speak to you bad or good. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord Yahweh has spoken. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the ground before the Lord. So as for Laban and Bethuel, they agree that God has orchestrated these events, and the decision is not really theirs to make, but it is God's. It is God's decision. God has already made that decision. It is obvious to Rebekah's family, and they agree that she is going to journey back to Abraham with the master, with the servant, and become the wife of the master's son. So how could one argue with the providential work of God? That is a rhetorical question that the servant asks, and obviously the answer to that is we can't argue with that, so yes, you can take her back. So the repetitive use of the covenant name Yahweh, again, does not imply that they were worshipers of Yahweh, but as pantheistic beings, they could not deny the divine elements of this mission. So they're willing to allow Rebekah to leave and marry the son of Abraham as the Lord had arranged. And upon hearing this news, what does the servant do? He bows low to worship Yahweh, just as he did at the well, just as he did back when he agreed to the oath. So we come to number 5 in the narrative here, and that is the dowry. And this is verse 53 in the beginning part of verse 54. So the servant brought out articles of silver and articles of gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah, and also gave precious things to her brother and to her mother. Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night. So dowries have been a part of cultural practice for thousands of years, and it is still practiced in many parts of the world today. If you want to take the daughter, the sister of a family, back to marry your child, you are going to pay a dowry. The more wealthy you are, the more lucrative that dowry is going to be. This is what is on the mind of Laban. This is why he's so interested in greeting the servant in the way that he did when he saw the gifts that Rebekah brought back to the house. When he heard that the master is a very wealthy man, Laban is thinking about the dowry that is going to be paid so that this servant can take Rebekah back to marry the master's son. So this practice is still takes place in many parts of the world today. And as this unfolds, and when they agree, I can visualize the servant just simply snapping his fingers, and all of the men who are out there with the camels waiting unload the camels and bring everything in, and they lavish all of these expensive gifts upon Rebekah and upon her family. And there is Laban say, man, oh man, this is even better than I thought. Look at all of this stuff. Laban is greedy and materialistic. Moses introduces us to this character trait of Laban, and as he deals with Rachel and Isaac's son Jacob later in Genesis, we will see this characteristic continue to be unfolded in that narrative. So after the gift giving, the household celebrates with a makeshift betrothal party. Everything has gone better than the servant has expected, and now we come to the request in number 6 in our outline, verse 54b. When they arose in the morning, the following morning, the servant said, send me away to my master. So this was probably not expected by the family. Although the night before they said, take her and go, they probably didn't think it was going to happen the very next morning. For the servant, this divine mission is more important than the family's preference. And so we see the tail end of this being worked out in verses 55 through 59. But her brother and her mother said, let the girl stay with us a few days, say 10, afterward she may go. He, the servant, said to them, do not delay me, since the Lord Yahweh has prospered my way. Send me away, that I may go to my master. And they said, we will call the girl and consult her wishes. Then they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. Thus they sent her away with her sister Rebekah and her nurse, with Abraham's servant and his men. So the desire to have Rebekah stay for a few days here is very, very normal. They want to have a proper goodbye. After all, she's going to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles. It is probable that they're not going to see her again. We don't know that at this point in the narrative. So their desire to have some time to say goodbye to Rebekah is very normal and very understandable. They were not expecting this betrothal to end on the next day with her going back. Betrothal periods lasted several weeks and several months, so they were not expecting for Rebekah to leave less than 24 hours after the betrothal was made known to them. So allowing her to stay for these 10 days would give them time to say goodbye, to make preparations, but the servant is compelled to complete this divine mission. As God has providentially orchestrated these events, he wants to take Rebekah back with him and go to Abraham and report the success of the mission. But the family is willing to allow Rebekah to have the final say, and she agrees. In the Hebrew, where she says, I will go, it's a single word, halak. And basically she says, yes, I will go. So many commentators here make a parallel between Abraham and Rebekah. As Abraham was willing to leave his homeland based upon the call of God on his life, Rebekah was also willing to leave her homeland by virtue of God's call on her life to go back and become the wife of Isaac. So we'll explore that in a little bit more detail next week. And while Scripture does not record it, I believe that God gave to Abraham the details of this plan. Abraham simply communicated these plans to his faithful servant. The faithful servant, under the providential hand of God, was able to accomplish those plans exactly as expected. And this would provide just another instance where Abraham could declare the greatness of God. Now, as I think about this, it's kind of difficult to pull a lot of principle out of this section of the narrative. But what we see here is that what God had spoke and what Abraham and the servant agreed to carry out, God graciously and providentially brought to pass. And that is the same thing that is true for you and I today. What God has spoken, what God has promised to you and I as his children, he will carry this out for his glory and for our good. It is up to us to apply our faith to who we know God to be, to what it is God has said, so that we can see his providential plans worked out in our lives. God wants to see those plans worked out in our lives more than you and I want to see those plans worked out in our lives. And every time we apply faith to our knowledge of God and we see the faithfulness of God lived out in our lives, it ought to cause us to bow before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and worship him and declare his greatness. And when we do that, not only through the words we speak, but through the lives we live, others are going to hear and are going to see that. Don't you believe that's true? That is why it is important for us to trust and obey, to follow the Lord, to do what it is he has called us to do, because he will see it come to pass. Join me in prayer.